Yeah.
That's what I use to thin out the green ink.
So, I'm gonna try. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second meeting of this group, Philosophy Talks. I know it's a very original name. I made it up myself. So yeah, we're just trying out. I'm trying out being a host for a group for the first time. And as I've mentioned to some of you already, I'm basically digging up all my old university books and rereading them and see if I can understand them better, or at least understand them as much as I did back then. That's the goal. And this topic here, last time we talked about Kierkegaard and focused on one of his last works. And this time we're gonna look at what is considered the main work of René Descartes, Meditations on the First Philosophy. I've got my Danish version here, so I read it in Danish, making it even more convoluted. But it was translated. This one was translated from the Latin version. So I'll try and introduce certain things about Descartes. There's some things I won't go into depth in. I'm gonna give a cursory overview here, and I'm also gonna try and keep the time a little bit more tight than last time. So I've gotta go for 30 minutes instead of an hour. So it might be a bit short. I'm gonna focus on. So basically, the work is considered his main work because that is where he gets in the most into detail about his metaphysics and about his notion of what is the job of philosophy as one thing. And his whole project here in this work is an epistemological project. He is trying to account for how can we assume we know anything about anything at all. So he's trying to lay out the foundations for how can we trust any science or anything objective in the first place, because he knew the skeptics at the time, and there were prevailing skeptics at the time, could basically draw anything into doubt. It's very easy to do that. And oftentimes philosophy would have a hard time defending itself against those claims. So in this work, he decides to try and go in and address some of those things. And the way he does it is a pretty sneaky maneuver, actually. He decides to take on the hat of an ultimate skeptic himself and use a method, see if I can say that, methodic doubt. He's trying to use a methodic doubt to get to the root of something that is necessarily true, or something that even the skeptics can't put into doubt. So he's trying to take on the role of a skeptic to dig down and come to some point, some ground zero point where it's like, right, this I'm definitely sure of. And I'll preface before I get further into it that there's a lot of criticism, a lot of valid criticism of Descartes. He was a very ambitious philosopher. He was trying to lay out a completely new philosophy, and he's often hailed as the father of modern philosophy as a consequence of that. So he introduced lots of problems that we're still dealing with today in philosophy, and he certainly set the goalpost very high, which is admirable. But many people and many philosophers today would say that many of his answers, or even most of his answers, are unsatisfactory, basically. But there are some interesting things to get into, and it's interesting to note as well. There's something we call Cartesian thought, and Cartesian is just a shorthand for his name. So it's basically his name is in Latin. And that's why when we talk about Cartesian thought, it goes back to him, because he was the one who introduced many of the ideas that we attribute with Cartesian thought. What is Cartesian thought? Well, it's a notion of dualism. It's quite famous for that. So having the distinction between mind and body, seeing mind as something incorporeal, intangible, indivisible. You can't slice up the mind as you can slice up a piece of pie, but you can slice up a piece of pie or anything physical. So how those relate and interact with each other is a big part of what he's trying to get into as well. So that's one of the things with Cartesian thought. The other part is also he introduced rationalism, or modern rationalism, and that would be like the big tug of war of modern philosophy between the 17th century and the 19th century, between rationalism and empiricism. And you can actually kind of thank Descartes for starting that battle, because he got a lot of reactions, even people contemporary to his time and people afterwards, that would be considered empiricists, who would adopt the other side of him, if you will. So he started a whole conflict and debate in philosophy that we can point back to him. and other people contemporary to his time. So that's just to say why he's relevant, why he's important, and also I dare to say that Cartesian thought is still a big part of our mental landscape these days. As soon as you start identifying yourself more with your mind than your body, or you talk about your body as being a thing separate from yourself, you're already thinking a bit like a Cartesian, right? So you're already getting into that domain. So it's definitely not dead by any stretch of the imagination, but it has suffered a lot of criticism, and again, as I say, a lot of valid criticism, because there are a lot of problems with it. But people seem quite often to operate as if they are Cartesians, and a lot of our laws, our politics, our sociology seem almost based on a Cartesian way of seeing people and humans. You could talk about how we see humans as separate from animals, because animals are almost seen as, well, he saw them, and a lot of people at the time saw animals basically as automatons or mechanical creatures that have no free will of their own. And the thing that separates humans from animals is that they have free will, and they can choose their own actions. So that is one thing, how it's still prevalent in our society. And now it's still, you might even be tempted to say, how it subconsciously layers a lot of our thought patterns in society today. So that's why he's relevant to talk about it, I think. The main focus, I'll focus mainly on the mind-body dualism, methodical doubt, and his ground zero, his cogito ergo sum, his famous quote, "I think, therefore I am." I'm sure most of you have heard about that one before. I'm going to focus less on his proving of God. And other later philosophers decided to disregard that as well, because for many people that will be less convincing or have less interest than his first and second meditation. Also he introduced some of the notions that there might be ideas that are innate, and later something that Kant would develop with his a priori ideas, because as a small example today, something that seems weird today, if we draw a triangle on a board and show that to a child, they will very easily conceptualize a triangle instead of seeing the flawed creation you have created, which is probably not even a triangle, it's just wavy lines that are not completely straight or whatever. But the child will seem to have there seems to be some kind of inbuilt ability, at least, to recognize, say, geometric shapes or things like that. And he was one of the first ones to really paint a picture of that fairly clearly, or delve into that. So that's why he's also relevant. And that's still something we're struggling with today to make sense of. That's my main introductory point. The problems are as problematic today as they were back then. And I like if any of you saw the video of Noam Chomsky talking about René Descartes there, I like his little quote, that many people think that the ghost in the machine was exercised, but what was exercised was the machine, not the ghost. Because later, just in a generation later, you have Newton coming in and saying, well, we actually have almost occult forces ruling the physical world. The physical world is not this predictable clockwork that we thought it was, So what was put into doubt suddenly was body and material things, not immaterial things, because that's still, as much of a problem now as it was back then. We still have a hard time accounting for immaterial things. So he divides the world up into this one quote here, or one terminology to keep it right: res extensa and res cogitans. So res extensa is like extended bodies, and that is his notion of physical matter and material things. They are extended in space and time, whereas the mind, or say God, or things like that, are not. They are not bound by time or space in the Cartesian worldview, right? So that is also important to have in mind when you get into his philosophy. A few other things he did. So funnily enough, interestingly enough, this one here, he delivered his work, his manuscript, to lots of theologians and philosophers before he actually published it. And he wanted to get all their objections and all their criticisms in, and then he wrote replies to every single one. And if you take all of that material, which I'm not going to do today, there's no way we're going to be able to get through any of that, but that actually took up 6 times the space as the work itself. So it seems to say he faced a lot of resistance even back then, and he was prepared to try and take up as much of the fight as possible. But he also invited the criticism in, which seems admirable, that he wanted to take in as many viewpoints as he possibly could. But as I mentioned, we're only going to focus on the first and second meditation of the 6 meditations. That's what it's divided into. So a little overview of the meditations here, if you want to get into it. It's basically divided into 6 meditations, and it's written in first-person view. So it's almost written like he invites you to sit down and meditate with him before the fireplace. So put on your winter coat and your mittens and snug yourself into a chair, shut out the outside world, gaze intently into the fire, and start thinking about things as clearly as you can. Meditation is Latin as well for afterthought or deep thought, getting into thinking about things deeply. So that is what he wanted to get across here. And it is rationalistic. So the idea is that often for rationalists, ideas are more real than the external world. So it seems completely in character that he would sit down before a fire, he would shut out the outside world to think about things that could be as clear as possible to him, without all the distractions of sensory perceptions or too many things going on. Now in the first meditation, he goes into his methodical doubt. That's his starting point. He starts in epistemology. And for those of you that don't know what epistemology is the knowing about knowing. It's basically almost thinking itself, or how we can know anything at all. And it often gets into the different sciences. How can we say that we have any knowledge in the first place? The second meditation, he goes into the nature of the human mind. So that's where the dualism starts coming in more. And he starts addressing he actually introduces the problem that most things in the external world are only accessed indirectly by us, by our perceptions. So that's another thing about the Cartesian way of seeing things. It's like you can't really access, not really, the external world, because there's a veil between you and that through your perceptions, and you got a limited apparatus to see it, which might be valid enough. There is definitely some validity in that notion. And that's also why they often emphasize, things in here, because things in the mind are the most clearest things. There's no barrier between that and yourself, because you are your mind. That's the Cartesian thought, right? But certainly nowadays we've got more alternatives to that could challenge that view. I mean, if you look at Freud, the one thing that Descartes thought was certain was the mind had his own thinking mind. If he had been introduced to Freud, that might have put some questions to that, because Freud shakes that idea that no, you can't even rely on your own mind, sort of thing, right? So it's a symptom of the times as well, where rationality and the thinking mind is almost put up on a pedestal and is seen as the greatest ideal. Third meditation, he focuses on proving the existence of God. Fourth meditation is about truth and falsehood, so he goes on from that to try and distinguish how can we say that anything is true, how can we say anything is false, and basically what a lot of it boils down to, and I like someone that had seen Michael Sucre as well. I like Michael's assertion that God is the big insurance policy of Descartes, right? God is the one thing that makes sure that reality makes sense, because at the end of the day, a good God, a perfect being, would not deceive us. So that's like his backup insurance policy is. I like that way of seeing it, because that seems to be definitely what he's getting into. He gets into clear and distinct ideas in fifth meditation, and the clear and distinct, that goes a little bit back to like the rationalistic notion of what's absolutely true. Things like geometry. Even if anything else is a lie, you can never say that a triangle doesn't have 3 sides. Right, so that's an example of a clear, distinct idea, something that can stand the test of time, and we don't need to make lots of empirical experiments to confirm it. We can just assume, based on its own logical conclusion, that it's true. Sixth meditation, he gets into material things, the external world. So he tries to make a full circle, and all the things that he doubted in the first meditation, he tries to affirm in the sixth meditation, be like, aha, now I've gone through all these 6 meditations here, now I've got a firm grasp on what is real. Now I can actually argue for the case where the material world is likely to be real. He still says it's only likely to be real, and everything else that I've gone through is definitely real, like the notion of God and the notion of mind and so on. Right, so I'll get a little bit into the methodical doubt here. By the way, I lost my timer, so I don't really have an actual overview of time, except there. That's fine. So, skeptic stance. What's he doing there? Well, he's using skepticism instrumentally here, with, of course, in mind to disprove it. So he wants to get back at the skeptics, right? He wants to show them how they're wrong, but the best way to do that is to take their way of seeing things, go through that whole process. Oh, taxi there, anyway they want. And then be able to show them from their own standpoint how it doesn't make sense to have the skeptic stance. His main arguments from the skeptic standpoint for drawing everything into doubt is, well, first he goes into the senses, how senses tend to deceive you, right? And he takes one example of looking out in the courtyard through the window, seeing people pass there, but actually the only thing he's seeing is mostly coats and hats. He's hardly seeing the people below the hats. He's just inferring that people are there. But really, maybe they could all be automatons. You have no idea. Maybe it's not humans that are inside those coats. He has no way of knowing. He's just inferring that from what his senses are telling him, right? But in that way, and he goes into the point that our senses have often deceived us before, so why should it deceive us in the future? If you've met a person that's deceived you before, how likely are you to trust them in the future? Well, he sort of makes that analogy to the senses. If the senses have tricked you before, and you thought something was the case, but it turned out it wasn't, why would you trust them going forward? Right, so he puts the senses into doubt. But then he counters that and he goes into like, okay, well, I'm fairly certain there can't be anything countering this point, that I'm sitting before this fireplace, I'm having this winter coat on. He pretends that this is taking place at the same time as he's writing, and I'm sitting here before the fire, I can feel the fire. How could I possibly call this into question? This is the only thing that I know is real, right? And then to counter that, he says, but what if I'm dreaming? Because when I'm dreaming, I'm fairly sure that it's real anyway. So in the dream, I don't know it's real. It feels very lifelike, but then I wake up and it turns out it was a dream. What if this whole life is one long dream? And that's where you can draw the analogies to the Matrix or other pop culture like that, Imagine that all that you experience is just one long dream. Or you're being deceived by something, or a computer program. He uses the evil genius or the evil demon. He imagines, what if it's not a good God? What if it's an evil God, malevolent God or spirit that is deceiving me and has fed me lies my whole life? What then, right? So that's how he can sort of work his way through and even call his immediate experience here into doubt. So here he needs his foundation, he needs his ground zero, and this is where you can really feel he's a mathematician, because boy does he hanker after, he wants something clear and certain, which you might say is typical of mathematicians, that they want something that is definitely true, don't want all this murky business of straying around in sensory darkness. So he starts going into like, well, okay, imagine that everything I thought I knew was true is a lie. Still, the one that's deceiving me has to be deceiving someone. I can't be a nothing entity, because then there would be no point in deceiving me. There has to be a subject, or maybe you could say an object, being deceived, right? I might be doubting my reality, or might be doubting, or I might not be doubting, but there's still an I doing these actions. And it's a bit grammatical here, which is sort of belying some of the criticism, because it's assuming that there must be a subject. So it's almost a grammatical rule he's getting to here without distinctly saying it, right? So he's saying, all right, there has to be an I. Cogito ergo sum. That's the idea, right? I think, therefore I am. So, you might say maybe more accurately, and it doesn't show up in Meditations, by the way. It's a quote from a previous work on his method, so it doesn't show up there. So if you're looking for it in Meditations, it won't show up, but it's basically there in essence, right? So he goes into what maybe more accurately you should say, I doubt, that proves I'm thinking, and that proves I exist. And it's and again, that's where this Cartesian thought kind of reveals its hand a little bit, right? Because it equates existence with thinking. So there's a very high emphasis on thinking. Thinking is basically seen as, that is you, right? Especially rational thinking. That is the true you, if you will. And again, there's also a few things that you could go in and attack on that point. But we'll wait with that a second there. Right, so that is what he's focusing on his first meditation. He gets to some kind of solid ground, but he's still left in the dark. And it's like, oh, I'll leave these things to the morrow. And it's organized as if there are 6 different meditations, 6 different days, just before he goes to sleep. And then he'll consider the questions on the next morning, you know. And in the second meditation, that's where he starts getting into, well, what is it actually that we doubt? It's mostly things that we doubt, mostly things that are external to us, but we can't doubt what is in our minds. And that is where he works his way towards that, because we have direct access to them. I already got into that a little bit here before. So the idea is that things are more real. The ideas of things are almost more real than the senses we have, because they're the only things that are unfiltered. He's also distancing himself from the Platonic idea of the soul being a captain on a ship. So he does address that question there, because it was at the same time an attack on scholasticism and Aristotelian thought, which has dominated Western thought for hundreds of years, for many, many centuries. And that was something that he was trying to criticize. And he actually makes an example of, well, if your body was a ship and you're the captain there and you feel pain, the captain wouldn't feel the pain of the ship. You just notice like, oh, okay, there's a hole in my hull. I gotta fix that. But the way we actually experience it is like, if there's a hole in your arm, your whole mind is probably swallowed up by that, right? So he's allowing more of a fusion between mind. They're still separate entities, but he's allowing more of a fusion, or they're sort of fused together, mind and body. So they're not quite as separate as in the Platonic notion. Also, they try to explain, and that's a problem. That's the main problem of dualism today, and also what I'm hoping the conversation might get a little bit into, because dualism has a really hard time trying to explain how does an immaterial thing, a completely different substance that's not even in the physical world, affect a physical body. Where's the union point? How can those two things interact at all? They shouldn't be able to interact, right? Especially if you have a mechanistic, which a lot of people had at this time, if you have a mechanistic notion of the world, that physical bodies interact with physical bodies, right? A ball can hit a ball, but you can't think a ball to move, right? So how does that work for our bodies? And basically the explanation they had back then, that he had, which is kind of ridiculous today, is the pineal gland. The pineal gland here at the base of your, I think here at the back of your head, somewhere around there, about pea-sized part.
It's like in the center.
Oh, is it here?
Between your eyes, yeah.
Oh, between your eyes there. Well, there you go. Well, so it's considered as a ridiculous notion today, but back then it was thought, hey, this is the key. This might be the keyhole where the soul can go in, or the mind can go in and actually affect the body. This is where they can meet and interact. So yeah, that's just to get into some of the flaws of that there. Finally, so that's sort of laying out the foundation, because that's actually the main things that he's getting into in his first and his second meditation. And I've gone into some of the criticisms already, but still, there is that problem that he's put out, that we do seem to have that experience of being almost an immaterial thing in a body, right? We seem to, that seems to correlate with a lot of our subjective experience. That it feels like I have free will and I can control my body as I want, and I'm not just my body. There's something else in there, right? But it's been drawn up, it's been pulled up more into doubt these days. but we still haven't been able to explain how that works if we live in a completely material universe, and if we should believe the empiricists or the monists, the material monists. How does that work then, that it seems like we can move our arm or we can move our head at our own volition, right? How does that work in with a completely, if we are nothing more than biochemistry and basic, almost a machine operating on biology? So that's how I think he's relevant today, because he brought that up, and it's interesting going back to see what he said about those things and how much we've disregarded of that now, and how much is still up in the air. And the methodical doubt as well. There is something useful about trying to, at least it's commendable trying to achieve something that is certain, even though most seem to agree these days that it's a pointless exercise. And that's basically where modern philosophy is nowadays, is it's almost given up on trying to come to a complete truth of anything, because it has just been so thoroughly criticized that we almost can't say anything for certain, which was his project, you know. But maybe there is something there where we should try and get back and grasp some deeper truth there, or try and find something that's certain and try and follow in his footsteps, but in a modified way. Also, other criticisms you could get into, like the notion of what if the I doesn't exist that does the thinking? What if thinking is a bit more like rain, and you could say it's thinking, it's raining? What if you have the more Buddhistic notion that there's no such thing as an ego, or there's no such thing as a subject? That's an illusion, right? That could be another criticism leveled at his philosophy. And also you can question, why should thinking be the essence of man or existing? Would you say that someone who is in a vegetative state or in a coma who seems unable to think, would you say they're not existing, you know? So that's more problems with the philosophy. And finally, it does seem to be bound up in Indo-European grammatical rules, because it seems to basically say there needs to be a subject to do these verbs. That is the notion of it. You know there are these verbs. You know some thinking, some doubting, some perceiving is being done. You must have someone doing that. And there's plenty of languages that don't have a subject showing up in them at all. So you could see it, basically, you could see it as him being bound up in grammar and cornering himself in talking more about grammar than the actual metaphysical reality of the world. Because really what he's looking for is a subject and a predicate, not necessarily a thinker and an I, or an entity that exists, right? So those are some of the common criticisms that I could scrounge up here. Also, some questions I think are interesting getting into, and I can see I'm definitely come up on enough time here, so I'll leave it at that. Yeah, how would we organize the world if we completely disregarded the dualist notion and we didn't see ourselves, well, maybe we saw ourselves as the material monists would, or maybe we saw ourselves as the idealistic monists would and see ourselves only as mind or only as body. How then should we change all our laws and policies? Because we don't seem to have laws or social notions that adhere completely to either of those, at least best I can tell, but maybe someone has something to add there. Also, you know, one thing that's a good thing, that was basically his project, so we could carry on his project. You could basically ask, if you live in the matrix and if everything is a lie, is there anything that can be true despite that? And that was basically his project, trying to build up from that. And then he gets into a more dubious account of, well, he's basically safeguarding himself, like he's saying, oh, all these things could be true, but God wouldn't make that the case. And that's his final backup plan, right? He does come to some things that he determines are true whether or not you live in the matrix or in an imaginary world. But then he goes to the notion as well, like, well, probably the world is true and we're not living in that world because God is good. That's basically his argument, which is not much of a satisfactory argument. Oh yeah, and finally, is there a point to ascertaining something that's true or irrefutable? Or is it better to bracket discussions about that a little bit like the phenomenologists would do, and just focus on subjective experience as it is without pondering what is actually real? That's another question that could be brought up here. Yeah, and okay, this might be a bit of an easy one because I kind of have, well, at least I have an opinion on that. Is the use of God as the insurance policy for Cartesian thought a cop-out? And if so, why? Or is it actually a valid argument? Is it a decent argument? Might make the case it is. I'll finish the presentation there because I think I've already gone over time. How long did that take, roughly?
About 25 minutes.
Was that 25 minutes? It said 30 minutes there. Okay.
Maybe 30, so maybe 30.
Brilliant. All right. Question time. Let's go up for some questions, open the floor, discuss a little bit, and then we'll spread out afterwards.
Can you give Descartes' definition of rationality? I seem to remember it something like, rationality is predicated on like meaning and values, and so there's this, material mind distinction there. I was just wondering.
His definition of rationality. So I haven't gotten into a specific definition of rationality, at least in the bits I've read. So I might be a bit hard pressed doing that actually. But I would say that he sees rationality as the essence of what it is to be a human being. So rationality is what separates us from animals. It's the one thing, because that was the problem here, especially in the high point of the Renaissance, when they started seeing the whole world as one big clockwork, as one big machine. Yeah. Who was to say that people are not machines as well? Yeah. And he comes from a Catholic background, and he did have the church hovering above him and the Inquisition going on at the same time. So we can speculate whether he was trying to cover his own butt from, excuse my language, from the church, or whether he actually believed these things. I think personally he was religious, but at the same time he was also a scientist. So part of his project was also to try and reunite the two.
I think he was obsessed with Galileo. I don't think he actually necessarily believed what he said. But I would like to pick upon something that you said at the very end, the last question. Should we continue to look at something irrefutable? And then you immediately went into a different word, which you took to be took to be a synonym for it, which you said irrefutable. As if the word real and irrefutable came together. And this is something Descartes believes, and it's something inherited from the skeptics, and the skeptics are mentally ill. One should never listen to the skeptics, right? So one should completely dissociate. This is the real problem that Descartes faces. He begins by believing the things that the skeptics say. And these are people that are, if you met them, you wouldn't trust them with your children. Why? Because it simply is not the case that to believe the world is real requires you to have any kind of irrefutable proof of anything. It's simply that you have to believe it is more likely, more probable, or more reasonable to say that when you go around describing the world and describing the things in it, and you say, there's my phone, there's my drink, and so on, that it is more reasonable to suppose that the things that you're saying are true because they're true. I mean, it would be less reasonable to suppose any other alternative, because every other alternative would require you to believe something in addition to that. It would require you to believe, it only appears to be true that all these things are here, but in addition there is also a God, or in addition there's also a demon, or in addition there's also this other thing. So Descartes was tricked by the skeptics into beginning with epistemology. He was tricked into beginning the whole conversation with certainty and uncertainty, refutability or irrefutability. But this is a trick. No human being ought regard their own certainty as a guide to anything. We're all idiots. So the fact that we have no certainty in life is not a good guide to anything. And I would say that philosophy has not abandoned the truth. It has simply abandoned the kind of megalomania that says that what we should be doing is trying to, in some kind of neurotic way, what can we write down that's certain? This is absurd.
Sure. Yeah, that's sort of the pragmatic criticism of both skepticism and Cartesian thought, I suppose, of being almost, as you say, neurotically obsessed with things that we can never grasp at in the first place.
Well,
and that would be one place to go to. I suppose you could, if you are a skeptic, and you can take up, because I partly agree with that. I partly agree with it, I would say. But
Well,
So,
In
but
terms of the
it,
certainty of statements, you mentioned that Descartes was obviously a mathematician, and obviously he came a bit before Fermat, who kind of defined like probability theory and everything. But rather than thinking about things in kind of absolute kind of binary, this statement is true or false, you could think about the world in a kind of probabilistic sense, where I assign 80% probability that this statement is true, etc. And that's probably a more healthy way of thinking about things. Do you think he didn't try to conceive of the world in that way?
well, that is actually what he's doing. Interestingly enough, when you mention that is actually what he's doing in the sixth meditation, because he's actually kind of going into that and saying, well, it might be, the skeptics might be right, and it might be true that all physical stuff is a lie, but I don't think that's very likely. But his notion of that not very likely is because God up there, he's a good guy. He wouldn't ensure that as. So it's slightly different methods of coming to the same conclusion, but basically getting almost to the same conclusion there. I find
this is why I like, if you read the original skeptics that he's replying to, Sextus Empiricus and the rest of them, they're not skeptics. They take as a given that the world is divided into the phenomenal and the material, and they take it as this is an incredible premise. This is an absolutely dogmatic religious premise that somehow there are these two worlds. There's the world of our experience and there's the real world. I would deny this completely, but they begin from that presumption. So these are dogmatists, and they push on to Descartes and others that there is this distinction. So Descartes then says, okay, neurotically, I've kind of absorbed this distinction between the real world and the world of images, and now I need, within this kind of neurotic paradox, how do I resolve the problem? And I would say that what he does in the sixth meditation and all the way through via God and everything else is his I just don't think there is this veil. I don't think we have to get to certainty. I don't think we have to distinguish between the res cogitans and the res essentia, and at least not in Descartes' way. And so this is why I think a lot of the language Descartes uses is really a kind of trap he's got himself into by arguing on the basis on the wrong premises. He's trying to get to the right conclusions, which is the probabilistic conclusion of what probably exists, which is the right conclusion. But he's starting from very extreme, very unlikely places, like these two worlds that we have to just reject that. Reject premise.
Yeah, it's an interesting notion. What is it you call that philosopher that would take up that stance?
Well,
I wonder, is that
Searle does. The latest philosopher to do would be Searle, but I mean, but I think most philosophers have had more of an aspectual view rather than a property view, or a substance view. So you can either say that there's two worlds, the world of experience and the world of physical reality, or you can say there's one world that has many different aspects, and those aspects can be characterized in different ways. And if you said there's one world with different aspects, then you really have no problem in saying, oh, well, how can we know reality using our mind? Well, our minds are just a different aspect of reality. They're in some sense just a product of reality in a different way. I mean, for example, the phenomenologists didn't do this. Phenomenologists took the Cartesian. I'm not going to monopolize the conversation too much, but the point is that
they took that project further.
They took the Cartesian project further, but what they ended up doing was failing, because as soon as they tried to describe experience, everything they say about experience ended up being a description of the world. They would always have to say, it seems to me as if there is a table and a glass. They could never say
there is a table and a glass.
But every word they used was about external reality. Because there is no language of experience. There isn't any.
Is it easier to kind of partition things into these different aspects of the world and the mind, rather than trying to bundle it up all into the same thing? Is there just not an aspect of it that is easier, just in terms of how to organise your thinking and how to? I mean, I agree it's lazy and potentially confusing.
Yeah, but there isn't the table in my head and the table.
No,
there aren't two objects.
It's all in one entanglement.
Well, it's one sort of. I mean, it's like when the camera takes a photograph of the mountain, there isn't a mountain in the camera.
No.
So there isn't the mountain in the camera and the mountain in the world, and these two things are different. And then we have to explain, how does a mountain inside the camera correspond to the mountain inside the world? This is insane. If the camera causes the mountain causes the camera to have a particular condition.
Yeah.
So the camera and the mountain are together part of the same reality.
I think it still misses the problem a bit of us being divided from the external. That's like the central problem, especially of Cartesian thought, that we are separated by perception, and sometimes we can't rely on the perception. Sometimes they lead us astray.
Could I jump in on that point?
Yeah.
Yeah, what you mentioned about where you were hoping the conversation might potentially go. I have to go in like 3 minutes, by the way.
Oh, sure.
I really wanted to get this in.
Go for it.
I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Thinking about this point that if if the mind is fundamentally immaterial, and then you have, material reality, which is fundamentally material, if they don't share any fundamental aspects, then how possibly could there be an explanation for their causal interaction? Exactly as you were saying. The really simple demonstration of what was the example Vivek used? It was here's like a causal interaction between like the physical world and mental experience, like qualia, the kind of ineffable, immeasurable experience. Like how beautiful a rose is or something, like ow, like contact, physical thing hits physical thing, I experience a qualia. Like there isn't that explanation there when you have that kind of mind-body dualism, separation, But I do think that, but it's strange because I do think there's something definitely to it, because like how possibly else could you account for subjective experience? Like you can do all the different measurement techniques you want, and you can break things down into their parts and do a Neil deGrasse Tyson and be like, oh yeah, it's the electrical impulses of the you're merely describing the phenomena, you're not actually accounting for it. That's a kind of trick of sophistry, I think, that many materialists do, which is they will describe and account for subjective experience, but they do not actually explain the substance of it itself. So I think there is an ineffable quality to whatever you might call mind, but again, there is that question of if these two worlds don't share any fundamental aspects, how the hell does it work? So clearly I think that idea is wrong.
I think there's definitely problems on both sides of that argument there. And they have a hard time squaring it up. Was there anyone else that wanted to jump in, by the way? Yeah.
I'm going to reply to her before she leaves, but
yeah, please go if you want to reply.
Okay, sure.
So I just want to ask, if I were to put several needles into your brain, and I were to turn one needle and it made the whole world shrink in your visual field, I were to turn another and it made all the colours brighter, I were to turn another and it made Felix's face go up, whatever we want to do, right? And I were to say, oh, do you want to be happy? And I turn another needle and I made you happy. And if I do want to be depressed, I turn another needle and made you depressed. If I say, you want to remember your childhood? And I turn another needle and you remember your childhood.
Yes.
Would you then regard there being some problem that materialists will regard that those things are essentially biochemical? In other words, the reason that we have this illusion that our experiences are not material is simply because we don't really control the material. But we can do. There's no obstacle to a neuroscientist coming in, just like a camera, playing with a camera changes all the dials. Neuroscientists could do that, right?
But we have no idea yet. But maybe in 200 years.
I can prescribe you anything you like.
I think that just because you can mechanically manipulate something doesn't mean that you have an account for its essential nature. Like I don't think that you have a full and complete.
Pretty close.
I don't think you have like a full and complete dominance over something or account for something or control of something just because you can manipulate it, like slightly a far example, but whatever. We can intervene in, I don't know, biological processes like, I don't know, germline editing. We could, CRISPR-Cas9 people edit their soma, their sperm and egg cells and change the way that humans are biologically, but you cannot foresee the repercussions. You cannot possibly encompass that entire thing. Just because you can intervene in a system doesn't mean you have an entire account for it and for its origin, I think.
Well, this is complexity theory, right? It's sort of just be quick before you comment. This is kind of what Penrose talks about in like the Emperor's New Mind. You can get into the biochemical technicalities of the microtubules and everything, but the key thing he says is consciousness is not a computation. In other words, there's something is a complexity in the mind and there's a complexity in the world.
But he said
there's
it's physical.
Yes, there's a relative complexity of how complex does the mind need to be to understand what then that's, and Donald Hoffman has something to say about that. But
I agree with Penrose.
Yeah.
Sorry, you had something?
Quick point and ask you a question.
Yeah, sure.
So,
I've got like 3 minutes.
if you think it's like this quality is new information, then all information is physical. Then it means physicalism again. because the information cannot be in a non-physical thing whatsoever.
Could you say more?
If you say I'm storing some information in a computer, it's a very physical thing, right? Like it's stored in an electron or zeros and ones. It's a very physical thing. So that is true with our brains as well. Like it stores all information physically somewhere. So no information cannot exist without anything physically attached to it. So therefore, if you think qualia has some information to it, then it has to be physical. So that's like physics argument. But you can chat more if you want to.
I again would think that
see there's a figure down there as well.
That's a mechanistic account rather than, or an account for the mechanism, not the phenomena.
But like, that assumes qualia is not new information then.
It might not be. Most people probably think it is.
Yeah. So, but if you think it is, then it's physical.
Either way,
what would be an example of new information?
Like the Mary's room argument, right? You have told her everything about how the rose is red, how does it look, all of that, and then when she comes out of the room for the first time from the black and white universe to a color universe, does she know anything new? Is that qualia new information about her?
If so, where is it stored?
What about ghost members? You know, when you lose a limb and you still have the feelings, you still have. How do you connect the body to the mind? Actually, how it's not there physical anymore, but you still feel. You have this experience.
Sure. Could you say more about your point there?
Well, I'm just trying to see the separation between the mind and the body. Like this has been quite a subject for him, and I would just try to understand exactly what would be the process to explain that phenomenon actually.
Well, I could give a mechanistic account for that, but not a philosophical one.
So it's more on the philosophical side. I just was curious about how we would explain this actually.
Explain exactly what. Could you repeat?
You know, like the phenomenon of the
Well, I
limb.
think-
Oh, phantom. Oh, okay.
What you're
Oh, that way.
Information. I mean, I don't know too much about the neurological kind of mechanism.
But more
behind
on
it.
the philosophical
But
side.
you could explain it in a way of sort of like the body has information that you have a left arm here.
Yeah.
Someone cuts off my left arm, maybe. So that in an ontological sense, I no longer have a left arm attached to my body, but my brain might not realise that instantaneously. It might take time.
That is
for
the
brain
case. You
to
have
adapt,
a
right? to
you have a
that.
mental schema of neurologically there is actually like a body map.
But it takes time to update.
Yeah, exactly. So
And that's the thing.
things as long as not.
Yeah.
Even with neurology in the picture, and even assuming neurology can maybe account for most of the mechanics that we see as things happening in the mind, but it might actually be more chemically induced. It still doesn't account for abstract ideas. How are they having an effect on the way we act and operate in the world? Like say an idea like justice or fairness. That's not something tangible. It's not something physical, but it still affects our behavior, the way we think about things or decide things.
But do they have to be different from an electrochemical process in order to be thoughts or to have meaning?
Do they need to be different from that?
In other words, does it need to be
if
like a rabbit
good,
working the controls, or
that's a good question.
Or maybe the electrochemical process itself
can be just as meaningful.
Is what the thoughts are.
Okay, I see.
And it's not reduced to that, but it's that's the physical aspect of it.
Right, in that sense. Okay, I get it. Yeah, and that is possible. Maybe that is the case. Maybe it just all gets reduced to. In your account, you wouldn't say reduced to, just explained as neurochemical processes, if you will.
Well, I mean,
So basically, okay, fine.
Oh, yeah, feel free.
Sorry. Okay, so basically, what regarding your question, so you asked how purely apparently mental things like ideas of justice or whatever can affect physical, right? So any ideas is a form of information, right? And as this gentleman said, information is physical. Information has to be recorded. Right? Information is basically has to be must have some physical representation in terms of bits or whatever, something like that, or whatever other forms of recording information might be. So information is physical. So that means ideas are physical, right? Because ideas are like algorithms of which we are employed to make some decisions, right?
What do you mean information must be physical?
Because information should exist as sort of recording, right? It's some recording.
Okay, it needs to be written down, needs to be spoken.
It can be stored in neural network. It can be stored like in any media, right? It requires media. Information can't exist without media, right? Otherwise, information is a form.
I wonder there if it's worth having a distinction between the storage medium and the information itself, because I think if you're less materialistic in your perception, you might say, well, there's a difference there between what's the medium for storing it, what's the information itself. And then you could have the information stored in a letter, in an account, but it's still the same information.
Like how information be information itself? How can be information be without being recorded?
Well, I guess the best argument for that would be that the same piece of information can show up in all kinds of physical manifestations, right? You could have a pictograph of it. You could have a spoken account of it. You could have it written down.
Right.
Many things like that.
But in all of these cases, it will be a way of recording information.
Yeah. Except if you just have it in your head.
Absolutely abstract information without being recorded anywhere, including memory.
Well, I mean, I would say all those cases are not the same information, and I think it's kind of a
Different pieces of information. Okay.
Well, I think what's happening in each case is that suppose that we say that we are souls. Suppose we begin from that premise. Then you would say what's happening in every case. Well, the picture is being apprehended by the soul as a picture of a mountain, and the letter is being apprehended by the soul as a description of a mountain, and the whatever you want to say, the computer algorithm is being apprehended by the soul as a description of a mountain. Now, none of these things have anything in common. None of them have no shared properties. The letter and the picture and the computer program do not share properties. The one is electrical, one is paper, So there is no physical properties that they share. What do they share? They share the fact that the soul will perceive in them a common form. Where is this form? Well, if you believe that we are souls, or we have souls, this form would be in us as an immaterial thing.
Yeah, basically from physics perspective, what is information? Information is a difference between conditional and unconditional entropy.
And that has nothing to do with pictures or text or anything else. These different sets of information. Physicists do not deal with information in a representational sense. So a picture, a letter, a computer program, these are not kinds of information that physics is interested in.
Why? Because
just not what the word means.
It's the same, because like what information? Information is something which makes you make some decisions. That's exactly, that's basically like physical Shannon's definitions of information like perfectly kind of explains that. That's difference between conditional and unconditional entropy. That's something which would decrease the degree of disorder.
Right. By the way, I think this is a good time to break up. So you could carry on that conversation. I think it's a good time for people just to break out in various groups and continue the conversations that they want. Same format as Examine Live.
Oh, what? You're stealing my format?
Yeah, I am. Definitely.